Hello and welcome! Today's video is about a Christmas gift which I got from Kostas, a viewer of my channel from Greece. The parcel came almost in time for Christmas and I unpacked it back then on the same day because I already knew from Kostas that the hardware inside has suffered from a battery leakage. After such a damage, at least the electrolyte from the battery should be neutralized as soon as possible before it dissolves all the copper traces, so I decided not to put it on a long queue. Inside the parcel there was an envelope with a promise for a small gift inside another gift inside another gift, which of course made me very curious. And in the envelope there was a very nice Christmas card with a ho 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 and a Santa hat, which unfortunately came loose. But nothing what can be fixed with a drop of glue. And inside the card there was a very cool Linux Inside sticker and a very warm wishes for this year. Kostas wrote, "I wish you the best for 2025. All the best for you, your family and everyone in the whole world. Peace and love and health." And very important, a peace sign, which sadly lost its meaning for many people in the world today. Thank you very much, Kostas. I absolutely join your wishes. And the Linux Inside is a very nice gift in a gift indeed. As I already mentioned many times, I use Linux full-time at work and at home, and this sticker will look great on my notebook. Thank you very much. Well, and now let's take a look at the hardware in the box. As you probably already recognized, this is a nice little 386DX mainboard. What makes this one special is that this board is based on the MX chipset, which has integrated 8 KB of cache. Most 386DX mainboards used external SRAM cache ICs with up to 128K, although most manufacturers delivered their boards with only 32K because it was very expensive. Still, even 32K sounds like a lot more than 8K, however, cache which was integrated into the MX chipset was very fast and could compete with other boards with external cache very well. I'm not sure what exactly made the 8K cache in the MX chipset so fast, but I believe to have seen in some specs that the integrated cache was some kind of write-back type, where the external cache on the most 386DX was rather slower write-through one. But as I said, I'm not sure. All I know is that despite that boards with the MX chipset had a lot less cache, they were still very competitive. The CPU on this board is an AMD AM386DX40 with its 40 MHz. It was the fastest real 386 CPU, at least back in the days. Well, and here is the mess as a result of a leaky battery. As you see, the battery has been already removed, but it has been done too late. The electrolyte was already spilled all over the PCB and dripped down along the RTC chip down here, following the logical conclusion that this board was most probably used in a vertical PC case or was stored vertically over the years. Which other issues did I find? As you see, all of the pin headers from the board were desoldered for some reason. Could be a work of gold hunters, but the pins were too carefully removed. Almost none of the solder holes were damaged, except the ones for the external battery, but that ones will not be needed anyway. Otherwise the board looked good. Even the memory slots were all still intact and none of the plastic hinges were broken. So it was time to neutralize the battery electrolyte and wash the board properly with some soap and water. Should you be confused by the fact that I use white vinegar to clean the boards, there is an old video about it on my channel. In short, the electrolyte from the battery is a base which corrodes the metal on the board. An acid like white vinegar can be used to neutralize the base and clean the corrosion. After that, the board has to be properly washed. I use normal tap water and soap for that, despite that many people are shocked seeing PC hardware in the water. However, water itself is harmless. In fact, the salts in the tap water is what could cause problems. When the water evaporates, salts can remain on the PCB, creating bridges between the contacts. So if you have a very hard water in your region, you probably should use distilled water instead, which is basically purified from salts. In my region, it's fine to use the tap water, but I also often use compressed air to blow the water from the PCB, and of course, it is also very important to be patient and properly dry the hardware before you connect it to the power again. By the way, some people even use a normal dishwasher to clean the boards. And after cleaning and drying, the board didn't look all that bad at all. The traces around the battery were obviously affected, but most of them only on the surface and seemed still to have connectivity. Of course, the RTC chip as well as the smaller components around the area had to be removed to see if more damage has been hiding below. And talking of damage, as I washed the board, I noticed something else. As I previously said, all of the golden plated pin headers have been removed by somebody. And here there were two jumpers to set the CPU clock generator. And as you probably can see, the trace which goes from the jumper towards the clock generator has been lifted. So this is something what also had to be fixed. First of all, I desoldered all of the components around the battery to make a better picture of the damage. On a damage from a leaky battery, often the solder joints on the back of the PCB are also affected. When they got oxidized, trying to solder those is like trying to solder a rock. The oxidation prevents old solder from melting and new solder just doesn't stick to it. So I get often the question how to proceed in such situations. And well, the only advice I can give here is to try to remove the oxidation. I usually scratch the solder joints with pliers or use the engraving tool to remove the oxide. After that, fresh solder can be added to melt the old solder in the joints and eventually soaked away with a desoldering station. Trying to go directly with desoldering station against the oxidized solder will just end up in a damaged PCB. So take your time to make it properly. This is something what I also painfully learned over the years. Another tip is to use a heat gun in parallel to the desoldering station and preheat the PCB. This helps a lot if you want to remove the components in a most gentle way. And last but not least, before you pull out the chips, wiggle every pin. They all have to be freely moving, otherwise you will guaranteed damage the pinholes. Taking out the chip, don't apply any force. If it doesn't want to go out easily, then at least one of the pins is probably still soldered, and pulling it with force will potentially damage the hole and could even lift the traces, like we saw on the clock generator previously. Luckily, the traces under the RTC chip looked great, and I had to concentrate only on the area around it. Unfortunately, some damage also has found its way under this 74F244 buffer. The clock generator I removed as well, to be able to fix the lifted trace properly. Of course, I could make this also without removing the chip, just by soldering a jumper wire on the back of the PCB, but since I already desoldered other chips, one more wasn't a big deal. By the way, the clock generator has a resistor soldered between the ground and the clock output pin, most probably just for the output clock stability. I guess this resistor should have been on the board by design and was added by the manufacturer as an in-production fix. As I mentioned, the traces around the battery didn't look all that bad. The battery damage could be worse. The solder mask got that interesting pattern with tiny cracks all over the place. The good news was that even the thin traces were still almost intact, with only small cracks here and there due to the corrosion, but nothing what couldn't be fixed. I had to clean the wires using a 0.3mm drill to get out the rests of the oxide and loose solder mask. Since it was not clear how the wires would look inside, I decided to enforce them with some solder and additional wire. For that, I used the engraving tool to clean up the copper so that solder could stick to it. Of course, all of the affected solder joints and traces had also to be cleaned and tinned. Here once again the ripped off trace to the clock generator. I fixed this with a piece of enameled copper wire. It was very important to check every trace in the area with battery damage. The pinholes of the buffer IC, which I previously removed, were almost completely eaten away by the corrosion, so I had to set a couple of patch wires. Luckily they are very short and barely visible. Another important detail and a very common issue are the corroded traces which get a tiny crack right before a through hole, like the keyboard clock trace on this board. As you probably can see, there is a tiny crack here, which also had to be patched with a wire. After all the patches have been made, it was time to put everything back together. Of course, I added sockets for all of the chips I desoldered previously. And here is another handy tip. When soldering pin headers, sometimes the pins don't sit properly in the plastic stripe and can slide away. If you solder them that way, one pin could end up being higher than the others. This can be prevented by using a jumper header, which is closed on one end so the pins can't simply slide through. Like, take a look at these two jumpers. The green one is open and the black one is closed. It is important because if you take a closed jumper and push the pins into it, they will not slide through and align properly. This has two advantages. First of all, as I said, the pins will be aligned. Second, it will be not as hot to hold the pins with your fingers when you solder those. After soldering everything back and putting the ICs into their new sockets, I set the clock generated jumpers to 80 MHz, since 386 CPUs need double clock and we have a 40 MHz 386DX, as you probably remember. And then the board was ready to be tested. First try was a mixed emotion. On one hand, there were some postcodes and the board showed some kind of life. On the other, it didn't beep and looked like it would freeze. Usually the board should have been beeping and complaining about missing memory, but well, some boards refuse to post at all if no memory has been inserted. So I added 4 modules 1 MB each. And this is one of the negative points of this particular board. It has only 4 memory slots, which means that it only is possible to have 4 MB of RAM using 4 1 MB modules. Or 16 MB using 4 MB modules. Remember, this is a 32-bit system and the modules are 8-bit each, so it requires 4 equal modules. Today it is not a big deal to find 4 MB memory modules, but back in the days it was a real limitation of this board, since 4 MB modules were extremely rare and expensive. There were similar boards on the market which had 8 memory slots and where you could extend the memory to 8 MB, but not on this one. But to be fair, 4 MB on a usual Office 386DX were also more than enough. The relief came as I heard 1 long and 8 short beeps coming from the PC speaker, which means a missing graphics card. So I added a VGA card and the relief was kind of short-living. The board was freezing again and on the screen I got this image to look at. Such behavior is most likely related to electrolytic capacitors, which this board almost doesn't have, or a crack in a trace. So I started to bend the board, pressing against different chips and turning on and off the system until I see some changes. And sometimes I even got a post screen to see, after which the board crashed again. After a while, I found that the board posted reliably when I pushed one of the ICs of the chipset against the PCB, so I pulled my microscope once again and checked the pins. They all looked good, but the chip was located near the battery and the solder joints were slightly oxidized, so I decided to reflow all connections. And after that, the board started to post reliably, so there was probably a bad solder joint somewhere around that chip indeed. Since the board didn't have any battery, the BIOS settings couldn't be safe and the board complained about CMOS checksum error, so I decided to fix that too and install a CR2032 battery. The good news was that the keyboard also worked and I could at least enter the BIOS configuration. To prevent the CR2032 battery from being charged, the board had to be modified. The diodes D3 and D4 were protecting the external battery, for which I didn't even install the pin headers anymore, since the holes were damaged anyway. So those diodes would be not needed anymore. The 5 volts from the PSU to the battery would normally come through the resistor R1 and charge the battery. Of course, that had to be removed as well, but in the way that 5 volts would still power the RTC chip when the power is on. So I eventually removed the diodes D3 and D4 and redirected the 5 volts through the R1 to the output of those diodes. So basically reused the traces of the external battery for 5 volts power on support and protected the 3 volts battery from charging. The 3 volts from the battery would be further delivered through D2. Before adding the CR2032 battery holder, I covered the area with nail varnish for protection, added a missing capacitor, which is responsible for voltage stability on the RTC chip, and eventually soldered the battery socket. By the way, in the past I got comments regarding similar modifications that the battery holder stands over the edge of the PCB and would not fit into the case. Well, on this edge there is always a gap of around 5 mm for the brackets of the ISA cards, so the battery holder has some space and should fit. After the mod, I of course checked the voltage, and when powered on, there was no significant voltage applied to the battery, so it didn't get recharged. On the RTC chip, on the other hand, I got almost 5 volts. With a new battery, the RTC got powered with almost 2.9 volts. There is some voltage drop on the diodes, but it should still be sufficient. In the BIOS of the system there are many options to try, but I didn't have time so far to experiment with all of those, though I ran some benchmarks to validate the system stability. In Doom, the system made 9416 real ticks, that is about 7.9 FPS. In sysinfo I got an index of 43.2, in 3D Bench 15.9, and in PC Player benchmark 3.9 FPS. If you compare those results to the ones of the other 386DX40 systems, you will see that the numbers actually look very good. Despite that this board has only 8 KB of cache, as I said, it is very fast and sometimes even outperforms another boards with 32K or even 64K of external cache. So if you want to build a 386 retro machine and have an opportunity to get your hands on such an MX chipset based model, don't be confused by missing cache chips on it. Such boards have a nice hidden surprise. Well, and this is almost it for today. The board is back to life, stable and working great. There is one thing though which had to be fixed. Off camera, I glued the red Santa hat back onto the card and now I'm completely happy. A big thank you to Kostas once again. I didn't have an MX board in my collection so far, and now thanks to you I'm happy owner of one. Most probably this is not the last time that I'll show it in my videos. It is a compact board which is nice for testing of components and benchmarking against other systems. As I said, this board doesn't allow to install 8 MB of RAM, but on a 386DX even 4 MB are enough. Furthermore, today it's not a problem anymore to install 16 MB here if needed. Maybe I'd also add a CPU socket here to be able to install and test other CPUs in the board, like for example Cyrix CX486DLC. But that would be a story for another day. And today I hope you enjoyed this resurrection. Thank you very much for watching and goodbye.